"Don't make a sound," Margaret whispered, her hand gripping my arm so tightly I could feel her knuckles through my sleeve. "Please, Linda, get down. Behind the coats." I stared at her. Margaret had worked in our home for 22 years. She had helped me raise my son after his father passed. She had sat with me in the hospital waiting room when Ethan broke his collarbone at 14. She was not a dramatic woman. She did not whisper. She did not grip. So when she pulled me toward the coat closet in the front hallway of my own house on the morning of my son's wedding, I didn't argue. I ducked behind the wool coats that smelled like cedar in old winters, and I held my breath. "She doesn't know I came back for the ring box," Margaret murmured through the crack in the door. "Don't come out. You need to hear this." And then she was gone, walking back down the hall toward the kitchen, her footsteps deliberately light. I stood in the dark between my late husband's pea coat and my old ski jacket, and I waited. I should have been across town already. I should have been at St. Andrew's Presbyterian, sitting in the front pew, watching the florist arrange white peonies along the end of each row. My son Ethan was getting married in 4 hours. His bride, Sophie, was somewhere in this house. She had asked to use our guest room to get ready, said her own apartment was too small for herself and her bridesmaids. I had said yes. Of course I had said yes. I wanted to start things well with her. I had been trying to start things well with her for 11 months. I heard heels on the hardwood floor of the upstairs hallway. Then the sound of someone coming down the staircase. I held very still. Sophie was on the phone. I could tell from the rhythm of her voice that particular cadence people have when they're talking and listening in turns. She passed the closet door without pausing. I pressed my eye to the crack. She was still in her robe, her dark hair pinned up loosely, and she was pacing the length of the living room with her back to me. Her voice was low, but the house was quiet. "I told you, it's today," she said. "Yes, today. The ceremony is at 2. A pause. She stopped walking. "That's not my problem anymore, Daniel. We've been over this." Another pause. Longer. "The house in Oakville is in his mother's name, not his, so that doesn't help us. But there's the account his firm moved him to partner last year, I told you that. The salary alone is—" She stopped, turned slightly. I stopped breathing entirely. But she was only walking toward the window. She stood with her back to the room, looking out at the front garden, and she kept talking. 3 months. Maybe 4, if I play it slowly. The joint account gets set up after the honeymoon. That's when. She paused again. No, I'm not backing out now. Do you have any idea how long I spent on this? I felt the cedar smell of the coats around me and I thought I might be sick. I had met Sophie 11 months ago when Ethan brought her to Thanksgiving dinner at this house. She had brought a bottle of Ontario Riesling and complimented my dining room and asked intelligent questions about my late husband's work in civil engineering. She was 34 years old and worked, she told us, as a financial compliance officer for a firm downtown. She was polished and warm and very, very good at the particular art of making older women feel seen. I had wanted to like her. I had tried to like her. But there was something I could not name, some frequency she operated on that made the back of my neck go tight whenever she was in the room. I had told myself it was grief. I had told myself it was protectiveness. I had told myself I was being the kind of mother my son would eventually need to gently correct. Ethan had looked so happy. "Just stay out of it until I call you," Sophie said into the phone. "And Daniel, do not come to the church. I'm serious. This is done between us. What we had is over. This is business now." She hung up, stood at the window for a moment with her hand pressed flat against the glass. Then she straightened her robe, tucked the phone into her pocket, and walked back toward the staircase with the focused calm of someone crossing an item off a list. I stayed in the closet for 3 full minutes after I heard her bedroom door close upstairs. Then Margaret appeared at the end of the hallway. She looked at my face and pressed her hand over her mouth. "I heard it before," she said quietly, guiding me into the kitchen, speaking barely above a whisper. 2 days ago. I wasn't sure. I thought maybe it was a different kind of conversation. Something I misunderstood. But yesterday I heard her on the phone again in the garden, and she said his name, Daniel. And something about a timeline. "How much did you hear today?" "Enough." She sat down across from me at the kitchen table. "Linda." She mentioned the Oakville house. The Oakville house was my mother's house. left to me when she passed 8 years ago. I rented it out to a young family from Mississauga. Ethan didn't own it. It was not his to give anyone. The fact that Sophie knew it existed and was factoring it into some kind of financial calculation made my hands go cold. "I need you to do something for me," I said. Margaret nodded before I finished the sentence. I called my sister Carol from the car. Carol is 71, a retired Crown attorney from Hamilton, and she has the emotional temperature of a woman who has spent 30 years watching people lie under oath. She does not panic. She processes. "Tell me exactly what you heard," she said. "Word for word if you can," I told her. The traffic on the QEW moved slowly around me, and I recited every sentence I could remember from inside that coat closet, and Carol was quiet the whole time. "The man she mentioned," Carol said when I finished. "Daniel. You have no idea who that is?" "None. And she specifically said the joint account. After the honeymoon." "Yes." "All right." She exhaled slowly. "This is going to sound like a lot to ask on your son's wedding morning, but I need you to trust me." Carol had a contact at the Ontario Securities Commission, a former colleague who owed her a favor and who was, as she put it, very good at finding things quickly. She wouldn't explain further. She told me to get to the church and act completely normal, and to not say a single word to Ethan until she called me back. "What if she calls me back after the ceremony?" I said. "Then we deal with it then. But Linda, do not say anything to him yet. You have one woman's conversation heard through a closet door. We need more than that." She was right. Carol was always right. I drove to street. Andrews Presbyterian and I sat in the front pew, and I watched the peonies nod gently in the air conditioning, and I smiled at Ethan's colleagues when they found their seats, and I thought about the way Sophie had said, "Do you have any idea how long I spent on this?" Ethan came to find me before the ceremony. He was in his navy suit, the one we'd chosen together at a shop on King Street, and he looked like his father. He had his father's way of straightening his cuffs when he was nervous, the same small, unconscious gesture, and for a moment I couldn't speak. "You okay, Mom?" He squeezed my hand. "You look wonderful," I said, which was true. Sophie's family just arrived from Calgary. He glanced toward the back of the church. "I think her aunt is already crying." "That's what aunts do," I said, and he laughed, and I kept my face very still. My phone was in my purse on silent, and I could feel it like a weight against my hip. The music started. The bridesmaids came down the aisle in sage green. Sophie appeared at the back of the church in a dress that was genuinely beautiful ivory, with a low back and long sleeves, and the room made that collective soft sound that wedding guests make, that exhale of collective feeling, and I watched my son's face when he saw her. He loved her. That was the worst part, I think. Standing there watching him watch her walk toward him, I understood that whatever happened next was going to break something in him, and I was the one who was going to have to be there when it did. My phone buzzed twice in my purse. I didn't look at it. The minister began. I kept my hands folded in my lap. It buzzed again. I opened my purse slowly, angling the screen away from the guests beside me. Carol had sent 3 messages. The last one said, "Call me right now." Before they get to the vows. I stood up. The woman beside me, one of Ethan's colleagues, I didn't know her name, looked up with mild surprise, and I mouthed "so sorry" and walked as quietly as I could toward the side door near the front of the church. The hallway outside was empty. It smelled like old stone and candle wax. I called Carol. She answered on the first ring. "Her name isn't Sophie Larkin," Carol said. "Her name is Sophie Arsenault. She has a fraud conviction in British Columbia from 2019. Financial exploitation of a dependent adult. She served 18 months of a 2-year sentence. Her probation ended 14 months ago." I put my hand against the stone wall. "The man named Daniel is Daniel Tremblay. They were together for at least 4 years. He has 2 prior fraud charges, both stayed. My contact found a civil lawsuit filed against both of them in Vancouver 3 years ago by a man named Gerald Hoffman. He was 78. He lost just over $300,000. Carol, I know. She's about to marry my son. I know. Which is why you need to go back in that room right now. I have thought about the next 60 seconds many times in the months since. I have thought about what it would have meant to stay in that hallway, to let the ceremony finish, to smile through the reception, eat the salmon, watch them cut the cake, and deal with it properly on Monday with lawyers and documentation and the full deliberate machinery of the law. Carol would have said that was the smarter choice. She would probably be right. But I thought about Gerald Hoffman, 78 years old, losing everything to a woman just like this one. And I thought about Ethan in his navy suit, looking at his own cuffs. And I thought about the coat closet and the cedar smell, and do you have any idea how long I spent on this? I opened the door back into the sanctuary. The minister had just said, "If anyone here has reason to believe, these two should not be joined in marriage." And I don't know if that was fate or coincidence or the particular timing that only seems to happen in real life, the kind of thing you'd cut from a script because it's too convenient. I walked up the center aisle. There is a specific silence that falls over a room when something has gone wrong. It's different from ordinary quiet. It has a texture to it. I felt it fall as I walked, and I kept my eyes on Ethan. And when I reached the altar, I turned to Sophie and I said, very calmly, "I need to speak with my son." The minister said my name. Ethan said my name. Sophie said nothing. She watched me with an expression I had not seen on her before. The polished warmth was gone, completely and instantly, the way a light goes out, and what was underneath it was very still and very cold. "Her name is Sophie Arsenault," I said to Ethan. "She has a fraud conviction from British Columbia. There's a man named Daniel Tremblay. She spoke to him this morning about your joint account and the Oakville property. Margaret heard her. I heard her." The silence had weight now. I could feel it on my shoulders. "She's done this before," I said. "To a man named Gerald Hoffman. He was 78 years old and he lost everything." Ethan was looking at me with an expression I couldn't read. Not anger exactly, something more like vertigo, the look of a person whose floor has moved. Sophie turned and walked back down the aisle. She didn't run. She walked. With the same deliberate calm I'd watched her cross the living room with that morning, and she pushed through the main doors of the church and was gone. Two of Ethan's colleagues, who were off-duty RCMP officers, were in the fourth row. I had not known that when I walked up the aisle. But Carol had called ahead, of course she had, and they were already standing when Sophie reached the foyer. I did not see the arrest. I was standing at the altar with my son, and Ethan had sat down on the altar steps in his navy suit with his head in his hands, and I sat down beside him, and neither of us said anything for a long time. The guests filed out slowly. The peonies nodded. The minister stood to one side with the particular helpless grace of a person who has prepared for every version of a wedding except this one. "How long did you know?" Ethan finally asked. "This morning. A few hours. Why didn't you tell me before?" "I didn't have proof before. Carol called me during the ceremony." I paused. "I'm sorry it happened here. I tried to think of another way." He was quiet for a long time. "The phone call Margaret heard," he said. "The Oakville house." "Yes, she knew about the Oakville house. I mentioned it once. In passing." He looked up at the light coming through the stained glass. "I thought she wasn't listening." "She was listening," I said. "She was always listening." We sat there together on the altar steps for another half hour. The florist came back at some point and quietly began removing the arrangements, working around us without comment, with the tactful efficiency of someone who has worked enough events to understand that some moments need to be absorbed before they can be moved through. Ethan went home with his cousin that afternoon. He didn't want to be alone and he didn't want to be with me, not yet. Not that day, and I understood that. Grief of that particular kind, the grief of a specific betrayal, needs its own room. I drove home. Margaret was still there. She had made tea and left it on the stove and gone home herself without leaving a note, which was exactly right. I sat at the kitchen table with the tea and I thought about Gerald Hoffman in Vancouver, and I hoped that wherever he was all right. I thought about Sophie Arsenault walking down the aisle of that church in an ivory dress, utterly composed, with a plan laid out in her head like a spreadsheet. I thought about the months ahead, the charges, the proceedings, the careful dismantling of a fiction she'd built over 11 months in my kitchen, at my Thanksgiving table, with my Riesling glasses. I thought about Ethan on those altar steps with his head in his hands. He called me that evening just after 8. He didn't say much. He asked if I was home, and I said yes, and he asked if Margaret had left any food in the fridge, and I said there was leftover chicken soup from the week before, which I could bring over if he wanted. He said that would be good. So I packed it up and drove across the city in the early dark of a June evening, and I let myself into his apartment and I heated the soup on his stove, and we sat at his small kitchen table and ate together without saying very much. And outside the window, Toronto was entirely indifferent to what had happened that day, the way cities are, all its lights going on as the sky went dark. "I keep thinking about the Riesling," Ethan said at some point. "What?" "The first Thanksgiving. She brought that bottle of Riesling. She made such a point of it, said she'd asked the woman at the LCBO specifically because she wanted something you'd like." I nodded slowly. "She researched you," he said, "before she even met you." "Probably." He stopped, looked at his soup. "That's a lot of work to do to someone." "Yes," I said, "it is." He was quiet for a moment. "How did you know? That morning when you called Carol, how did you know it was real and not just something I'd misunderstand if you told me?" I thought about that. About the coat closet and the cedar smell and the specific tone of Sophie's voice. The way she'd said this is business now, with no change in her breathing. The way she'd pressed her hand flat against the window glass afterward, not in distress, but in the manner of someone pausing before the next task. "I've known a few people in my life," I said, "who were very good at deciding what other people were worth to them. Your grandmother had a word for it. She called it cold arithmetic. The way some people look at a room and only see what can be taken from it." I looked at my son. I heard it in her voice. It wasn't a feeling. It was arithmetic. Ethan nodded slowly. He looked like his father. Right then, in that particular way, not in his features but in the quality of his stillness, the way he absorbed difficult things. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for walking up that aisle. I would do it 100 times," I said. He smiled, a small, tired smile. "I know. That's the thing about you, Mom. You would." The legal proceedings took several months. Sophie Arsenault and Daniel Tremblay were both charged. There was more than Ethan Carroll's contact found at least 2 other men in Ontario who had been targeted in the previous 3 years. The Gerald Hoffman case in Vancouver was reopened. I was told later that a restitution order was part of the sentencing discussion. I didn't follow every detail. That wasn't my job anymore. Ethan was back at work within 2 weeks. He didn't talk about Sophie much after that. Once, about 4 months later, we were walking along the waterfront trail in Oakville near my mother's old house, and he said out of nowhere, "I think I knew something was off. I think I chose not to know." I didn't say anything, because there wasn't anything to say that wouldn't have felt like a verdict. "I'm telling myself," he said, "that choosing not to know and choosing not to deserve it are 2 different things." "They are," I said. "They absolutely are." We kept walking. The lake was very flat and gray-green that afternoon, the way Lake Ontario gets in October, and the trees along the path had gone amber and copper and that particular shade of red that only exists for about 10 days a year in this part of the world, and my son was beside me, whole and forward-facing, and I thought about the coat closet and the cedar smell and the half hour on the altar steps and the soup on the stove. There is a thing people say about a mother's instinct. They say it like it's mystical, like it's some soft, inexplicable force. But it isn't mystical. It's just paying attention. It's 20, 30, 40 years of loving a specific person so completely that you learn the precise frequency of what's right for them. And when something is wrong, you feel it the way you feel, a change in weather, not in your heart, not in some vague intuition, but in your body, in the back of your neck, in the particular texture of the silence in a room. I listened to that frequency. That is all I did. And if you are a mother watching this, or a father, or anyone who has ever stood between someone they love and something that wants to hurt them, trust that frequency. Trust it even when you can't explain it. Trust it even when it makes you walk up the center aisle of a church while everyone is watching. Because the cost of being wrong is embarrassment. And the cost of saying nothing is everything else. Thank you for sitting with this story today. If it stayed with you the way it stayed with me, leave a comment below. I read every one. And if you know someone who needs to hear this, share it with them. Take care of yourselves and take care of each other.